The Sahara does not care who you are. It does not care which flag is sewn to your sleeve, which language you pray in, or which nation promised you that dying here was worth something. The desert receives all men the same, with indifference, with silence, with heat that arrives before sunrise and does not release its grip until long after dark. By the autumn of 1942, a strip of North African coastline no wider than a man could walk in 2 days had become one of the most contested patches of earth on the planet. The Western Desert. The stretch of scrub and stone running from the Egyptian frontier westward into Libya. A place where the horizon dissolved into shimmer and the ground gave nothing, asked nothing and forgave nothing. Here, 2 armies had been chasing each other back and forth for 2 years. The British 8th Army and the German Afrika Korps, and between them, a theater of war that military historians would one day call, with a certain uncomfortable admiration, the war without hate. That phrase did not mean the war was kind. It was not. Men died in enormous numbers out here. They were burned alive inside tanks that became furnaces. They were cut in half by artillery. They lay out in the open for days before anyone could reach them, in temperatures that turned wounds septic within hours. The Desert War was brutal in every way a war can be brutal. But it was also, in some strange and difficult to explain way, something else. Something that the fronts in Russia or the Pacific or the cities of occupied Europe were not. It was a war where men on opposite sides sometimes stopped long enough to look at each other. Not always. Not even often. But enough that the stories survived, passed down through letters and diaries and the quiet recollections of men who carried them home and never quite knew what to do with them. This is one of those stories. Or rather, it is several of them, gathered together across different years and different places, because the act itself, one soldier offering his water to an enemy who might die without it, happened more than once. It happened in ways no one expected. It happened between men who had been trained to see each other as less than human, who had believed, honestly and completely, the propaganda that made killing easier. And each time it happened, something shifted. Something that the war had worked very hard to destroy was briefly, unexpectedly, restored. To understand what the sharing of water meant out there, you have to understand first what water meant. In the Western Desert, a man could be dead from dehydration in less than a day. The sun drew moisture from the body at a rate the body could not replace without constant resupply. Thirst out here was not the mild discomfort of a summer afternoon. It was a physical catastrophe that arrived in stages. First the dryness of the mouth, then the thickening of thought, then the swelling of the tongue, then delirium, then a particular kind of despair that had no name but that soldiers who survived it described in almost identical terms. You stop caring about the war, one British lieutenant wrote in his diary sometime in early 1942. You stop caring about winning or losing or who is watching. You care only about the water. It becomes the only real thing in the world. German soldiers said the same. The diaries recovered from Afrika Korps men after the war used different words. Wasser, Durst, Verdursen, but the meaning is identical. Water was currency. Water was survival. Water was, in the most literal sense, the difference between continuing to exist and not. Each man in the desert was issued a daily ration, roughly 4 pints per day in standard conditions, less when supply lines were stretched, which was often. That ration had to cover drinking, cooking, washing wounds, and the basic maintenance of a fighting man's ability to function. It was never quite enough. It was rarely what the quartermasters promised. British soldiers carried their water in standard-issue canteens. German soldiers carried Feldflaschen. Both were battered, scratched things that men kept close to their bodies even when sleeping because losing your canteen in the desert was not a minor inconvenience. It could be a death sentence. The Afrika Korps had been in North Africa since February 1941, dispatched by Hitler to prevent Italy's collapsing North African campaign from becoming a catastrophe. Their commander, Erwin Rommel, would become one of the war's most complicated figures. A general whose tactical brilliance was undeniable, whose personal cruelty was largely absent, and who would later die for participating in a plot to kill the man who sent him there. But in 1941 and 1942, Rommel was simply the problem. The relentless, unexpected, frustrating problem that kept the British 8th Army from settling the Desert War on its own terms. He drove his men hard. He drove himself harder. And he understood, in a way that not all commanders did, that the desert imposed its own rules, and that the man who tried to ignore those rules would be punished by something far more impartial than any enemy. One of those rules was about water. Rommel had issued a standing order, not famous, not widely publicized, but documented in the records of the Afrika Korps Quartermaster Division, that wounded prisoners of war were to receive the same ration of water as wounded German soldiers. Not more. Not the abundance of mercy that would later become a legend. Simply the same. Equal thirst. Equal relief. It was a small thing. In the arithmetic of a war that killed hundreds of thousands of men, it was an almost invisible thing. But the men who received it did not find it invisible at all. Private Thomas Hartley of the 8th Royal Tank Regiment was wounded on November 23, 1941, during Operation Crusader, in the fighting around Sidi Rezegh in Libya. His tank had been hit by an 88mm shell in the late afternoon. The round came in low, penetrated the hull, and killed his commander and his driver instantly. Hartley was thrown clear when the vehicle brewed up, the soldier's phrase for the particular horror of a tank catching fire, and he landed in the sand some yards away, with a gash along his left side from where the hatch edge had caught him on the way out, and the beginning of a concussion that turned the world into something slow and tilted. He lay in the sand for a long time. Around him, the battle continued and then gradually, with the indifference of battles, moved elsewhere. By the time German infantry came through clearing the ground, it was nearly dark. Hartley was conscious but unable to stand. He had lost a considerable amount of blood and had drunk the last of his water sometime in the middle of the afternoon. He described what happened next in a letter written to his mother from a prisoner of war camp in Italy several months later. His words have a careful quality, as if he was still not entirely sure he should be writing them down. A German soldier, I would put him at about 19, younger than me, knelt down beside me and looked at my side. He didn't speak any English and I didn't speak German, but he seemed to understand what he was looking at. He pressed a field dressing against the wound with one hand and held it there while he unscrewed his own canteen with the other. He gave me water. Just like that. His own water. I remember thinking that I should say something, or that I should feel something other than just the relief of it. But I was too dry and too tired and too dizzy to feel anything except grateful. Hartley was taken prisoner that evening. He survived the war. He died in Sheffield in 1978. He kept the letter he had written to his mother. His daughter found it in a box after his death, folded between two photographs, one of his tank crew taken in Egypt, one of his family outside a terraced house somewhere in the north of England. She could not be certain, she said later, which one he had looked at more often. These moments did not begin with strategy or ideology. They began with the body. With the simple animal fact of watching another human being suffer from the same thing you understood completely, the same thirst, the same sun, the same sand in the mouth and the eyes and the raw cracked lips. The desert stripped away the language of nationhood. It stripped away the posters and the speeches and the careful architecture of hatred that wartime governments built and maintained at considerable expense. What remained, once all of that was stripped away, was something much older. Something that did not require translation. You are thirsty. I have water. Here, It sounds so simple written that way. But the simplicity is deceptive. Because in the act of handing over your water, your survival ration, the thing your body needed, the thing the man next to you needed, the thing there was never quite enough of, you were making a choice that the war had specifically and deliberately tried to make impossible. You were choosing the man in front of you over the enemy you had been told he was. That choice cost something. It always cost something. And the men who made it generally knew what they were doing when they did it. By the summer of 1942, the Desert War had reached a particular kind of exhaustion. Rommel had pushed the British back to El Alamein, a small railway halt on the Egyptian coast about 60 miles west of Alexandria. For the first time in 2 years, the Axis forces were close enough to Egypt that the fall of Cairo felt like a realistic possibility. The British were digging in. The Germans were stretched to their limits. Both armies were tired in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. They had been fighting in this landscape for 18 months. They had buried their dead in sand and watched the sand shift and sometimes unbury them again. They had eaten dust and sweated through their uniforms every day and repaired the same equipment over and over until the repairs were holding together repairs. In this exhaustion, something happened that tends not to happen in the early, ideologically charged months of a war. Men began very quietly to see the men on the other side. Not to like them. Not to forgive them for being there, for fighting under that flag, for being the reason their friends were dead. But to see them, to recognize, with a recognition that was almost physical, that the figure across the wire or across the flat white ground was not fundamentally different from the figure looking at him. This recognition did not happen all at once. It came in fragments. It came through small observations, accumulated over months of fighting the same enemy in the same landscape. The British noticed that the Germans buried their own dead with the same careful attention they gave it. The Germans noticed that British prisoners, arriving thirsty and sunburned after a long march, were no more dangerous looking than their own men in the same condition. Both sides had long since concluded that the Italians were not enthusiastic about this war in the way the propaganda said everyone was supposed to be enthusiastic about it, and that conclusion had a leveling effect. If one set of men could be miserable and reluctant, then the category of miserable and reluctant was perhaps larger than the recruiters had suggested. It was in this atmosphere, the second summer, the long heat, the accumulated weariness, that the exchanges began to happen more frequently. Not truces. Not fraternization in any formal sense. The desert was too open, too exposed, the battle lines too fluid for anything so structured. What happened instead was informal, opportunistic, and almost always connected to the same circumstances. Men who had been wounded and left behind when a position was overrun. Men whose vehicles had broken down in the open. Men who had become separated from their units during the night and wandered in the wrong direction until morning found them in territory that was suddenly someone else's. In each case, what determined the outcome was not always which side had won the most recent skirmish. What determined it, more often than military historians find comfortable to acknowledge, was the character of the individual man who arrived first, and whether he had water to spare. Corporal Werner Baumgartner of the 90th Light Infantry Division wrote about an encounter in his field diary in August 1942. The diary survived because Baumgartner's family kept it, and because a German historian named Dieter Koch included excerpts in a 1987 study of soldier experience in the North African campaign. Baumgartner had been part of a small patrol moving through ground that had changed hands 3 times in the previous week. The patrol came across a British soldier lying in the shade of a knocked-out vehicle, a figure so still that Baumgartner's first thought was that he was already dead. He was not dead. He was a sergeant of the Durham Light Infantry, and he had been lying there for somewhere between 36 and 48 hours with a bullet wound through his lower leg and no water. Baumgartner wrote, **He looked up at me with an expression I have seen in very ill men, very old men, and once in a dog that had been run over on the road near my family's house. It is an expression that has nothing to do with war. It is simply the face of a living thing that believes it is about to stop living. The German corporal gave him water from his own canteen. He dressed the wound with what he had. He left him with the remainder of the water and marked the location on his map so that a British patrol, if one came through, would find the position. He did not take the man prisoner. The patrol was too small and moving too fast. He could not have carried him. He wrote, **I don't know what happened to him afterward. I think about this sometimes. Not in a painful way exactly. More in the way you think about a road that forked and you wonder what was on the other path. He was someone's son. He was frightened. The water seemed to help. Baumgartner survived the war. He returned to Germany in 1946 and worked for many years as a schoolteacher in Bavaria. He never found out what happened to the British sergeant. The entry in the diary ends there, and the next entry is dated 4 days later and concerns a supply problem with replacement vehicle parts. Some stories do not resolve. They simply exist incompletely at the edge of what can be known. There was a particular quality to these encounters that recurs in the testimonies, a quality of suspension, of the war briefly holding its breath. The men who described them often used the same words, or words that translated to the same meaning. Time stopped. The noise went away. I forgot for a moment where I was. What they were describing, in the language available to them, the language of men who had grown up between the wars who had little formal vocabulary for psychological experience, was the collapse of the frame. The frame that war builds around everything, that turns a human being into a target, that makes the killing feel like something other than what it is. When a man is dying of thirst and another man gives him water, the frame cannot hold. The categories dissolve. There is only the canteen in the hand that passes it and the throat that receives it, and for a moment that those who experienced it apparently never forgot, all the careful machinery of dehumanization simply stops working. It does not stop permanently. That is the tragedy of it. The war resumes. The categories are rebuilt. The men go back to trying to kill each other. But the moment has happened and it cannot be taken back, and it leaves something behind in both men, something that the war will spend considerable energy for the remainder of their lives trying to bury. In the spring of 1943, as the Afrika Korps was in its final weeks in North Africa before the mass surrender at Tunis, a sequence of events unfolded near the Matmata Hills in southern Tunisia that would be recorded in 3 separate sources: a British battalion diary, a German regimental history published in 1957, and the memoir of a New Zealand medical officer named Captain Andrew Breen. Breen's account is the most detailed because Breen was a doctor and trained observers noticed different things. A German patrol had been caught in a British artillery bombardment while crossing open ground. 3 men had been killed outright. 2 had been wounded, 1 seriously, 1 less so. The remaining men had retreated under fire, unable to take the wounded with them. The less seriously wounded German soldier, a young private named in Breen's account only as Karl, had managed to drag himself and his more severely wounded companion, whom Breen calls Hans, noting that he never learned their actual surnames, to a shallow depression in the ground, where they lay through the afternoon and into the evening. A British stretcher party came through at dusk. Among them was Captain Breen. He found 2 young men, both exhausted, both badly in need of water, one of them drifting in and out of consciousness from blood loss. He wrote later, the one who was still fully conscious looked up at me when I arrived and I saw, very clearly, that he expected to be shot. Not as a possibility. As a certainty. He was quite calm about it in the way that people become calm about things they believe are unavoidable. I gave him water first. Then I attended to his companion. Then I gave him more water and told him, through our interpreter, one of the South African soldiers in our party, that they would both be taken to a medical facility and treated. He said something in German. The interpreter translated it. He said, I thought you would kill us. I said, why would I do that? He did not have an answer for that. Or rather, he had an answer, But it was the wrong kind of answer for the situation we were now in, which was no longer the situation either of us had expected to be in. Breen treated both men. Both survived. The more seriously wounded one lost his left arm below the elbow, but he lived. They were taken to a prisoner of war facility and eventually repatriated after the war's end. Breen continued practicing medicine after the war. He retired in Christchurch, New Zealand in 1971. His memoir, a privately printed document, never commercially published, that circulated among family and colleagues, contains a line at the end of the Tunisia section that many who read it have found difficult to move past. He thought I would kill him because that is what he had been told we would do. I had been told the same about him. We had both been lied to in exactly the same way for exactly the same reasons, by people who were nowhere near that hillside. The Pacific was different. In North Africa, a kind of informal chivalry had taken root, shaped partly by the landscape, partly by the nature of a mobile armored war where today's captured position was tomorrow's recaptured one, partly by the mutual respect that developed between professional soldiers in a hard theater. It was not universal. It was not guaranteed. But it existed as a recognizable current running beneath the surface of the fighting. In the Pacific, that current was almost entirely absent. The war in the Pacific was characterized, on both sides, by a ferocity and a systematic dehumanization that went well beyond what the European theater produced. Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated with a view of surrender that made capture unthinkable. To be taken prisoner was to cease to exist as a person in any meaningful sense. American soldiers, shaped by the attack on Pearl Harbor and by the desperate fighting at Guadalcanal and Bataan, had developed a hatred for their enemy that was of a different character than the enmity between the Western Allies and Germany. And yet, even here, even in this most merciless of theaters, the moments happened. They happened less often. They happened in stranger circumstances. They happened in ways that the men who experienced them found harder to talk about afterward, because the distance between the moment and the official version of the war was so much greater. Sergeant James Cavanaugh of the 24th Infantry Division was on Leyte in the Philippines in the autumn of 1944 when his patrol encountered a Japanese soldier alone in the jungle. Alone, unarmed, clearly ill, clearly lost from his unit, clearly dying. The soldier was suffering from severe dehydration compounded by what appeared to be dysentery. He was unable to walk. He was unable to offer any resistance. He was, by any clinical measure, not a threat. Cavanaugh later gave an interview to a military historian in 1971, recorded as part of an oral history project at a university in Ohio. The interview was conducted in Cavanaugh's kitchen, and the recording preserves the background sound of a radio playing somewhere in the house. Cavanaugh said, every single thing I had been told, every single thing I had seen, said leave him or finish it. Those were the only two options that made any sense inside the logic of what we were doing out there. He paused in the recording for a long moment. But I looked at him and he looked at me and he wasn't a soldier right then. He was just a man who was about to die of thirst, which is an awful way to die, and I knew it was awful because I had come close to it myself twice on that island. So I gave him my canteen. There is another long pause in the recording. He drank it. He held it with both hands like a child would hold a cup. He looked at me over the top of it the whole time he was drinking. I don't know what he was thinking. I never will. He might have been thinking about his mother or his home or how afraid he was. He might have been thinking about how many Americans he had killed. I don't know. I couldn't know. I left him there. I couldn't take him with us and I wasn't going to do the other thing. Maybe someone found him. Maybe they didn't. Cavanaugh paused again. I'm not saying I was right. I'm not saying it changed anything. I'm saying it was what I did and I've thought about it maybe 10,000 times since then, and I still don't know exactly what it means. I just know I couldn't watch him die of thirst while I had water. The interview is 17 minutes long. The historian asked several follow-up questions about Pacific operations and strategy. Cavanaugh answered them. But he returned, without prompting, near the end of the interview to the moment in the jungle. You know what stayed with me, he said. The way he held the canteen. 2 hands. Like it was the most precious thing in the world. Which right then it was. Men who survived these moments did not, in most cases, talk about them. Not immediately. Not for many years. Not until the war was far enough in the past that it had acquired the quality of something that had happened to someone else. Or until they were old enough that the fear of being misunderstood had receded in proportion to the fear of dying without having said it. The silence was not shame exactly. It was something more complicated. What they had done, offering water, accepting water, treating a man's wound when they were not required to, choosing not to fire when they could have, was not technically against orders. It was not collaboration or treason. But it existed in a kind of moral space that the official narrative of the war had no category for. The official narrative had heroes and enemies. It had sacrifice and victory and the clear trajectory of a just cause prevailing over an unjust one. It had no good place for the story of 2 exhausted men in the same desert sharing the last water in a canteen, because that story contained an implicit acknowledgement that complicated everything. The man on the other side was also a man. Not a monster. Not a representative of a monstrous system, though the systems were monstrous, one more monstrous than the other, a distinction that mattered enormously historically and that the men in those moments were not denying. But a man with 2 hands and a throat that needed water and a face that showed, without any possibility of disguise, exactly how afraid and exhausted and far from home he was. That acknowledgement cost something. It cost the comfortable certainty that the war was about the simple conflict between good and bad. It introduced a complexity that was very difficult to carry alongside everything else the war required men to carry. So they said nothing. And the silence accumulated into decades. The consequences were not only internal. In several documented cases, the act of sharing water in the desert had effects that rippled outward in ways that could not have been predicted. There are letters from British prisoners of war in Italy and Germany in 1942 and 1943 that describe, in careful, understated language, a quality of treatment that surprised them. Not luxury, the conditions in most prisoner of war camps were poor to miserable, but a particular consideration on the part of individual guards and officers that stood out against the background of institutional harshness. Some of these men attributed it, years later, to the reputation that had developed around the Desert War. The Afrika Korps knew that their wounded prisoners had been treated with a certain care by British medical units. That knowledge moved through a military culture the way all knowledge moves, imperfectly, partially but persistently, and it shaped behavior in ways that were small and individual but that collectively added up to something. A guard who brought an extra ration of bread to a sick prisoner. A camp doctor who used his limited supplies to treat a wound that was technically outside his mandate. An officer who chose not to report an infraction that could have resulted in punishment. These were not gestures of sympathy for the enemy's cause. They were something more basic, a residue of the recognition that the desert had forced on men who would have preferred, perhaps, not to have been forced to recognize it. In the Pacific, no such residue existed in any systemic sense. The conditions were too different, the ideological gulf too absolute, the accumulated bitterness too deep. But even there, in scattered individual cases, something was transmitted. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Haynes, who commanded a prisoner of war interrogation unit in the Pacific in 1944 and 1945, wrote in a post-war report that prisoners who had been treated with basic human dignity before being interrogated, given water, allowed to rest, not beaten, consistently provided more useful intelligence than those who had been treated with contempt or violence. He was making a practical point. He was not making a moral argument. But the practical point rested on the same foundation as the moral argument, that men who had been shown that you saw them as human beings behaved differently than men who had been shown the opposite. The water, in other words, was doing something beyond keeping a body alive. It was transmitting information. It was saying, I see you. Not as a problem to be solved or a target to be engaged. I see you for this moment as what you are. Private Heinz Stoltz of the Afrika Korps was captured at Tunis in May 1943, one of the 250,000 Axis soldiers taken prisoner in the final collapse of the North African campaign. He was 23 years old. He had been in North Africa for 14 months. He had fought at Tobruk and at El Alamein and at a dozen smaller engagements whose names he could still recite in order 6 decades later when a German television documentary crew came to film him at his home in Dusseldorf. He was 83 at the time of the filming. He sat in a garden chair with a cup of tea and spoke about North Africa with the fluency of a man who has revisited the same memories so many times that they have become a kind of separate country he can navigate in his sleep. He talked about the heat, about the flies, about the peculiar democracy of the desert that meant officers and enlisted men ate the same food and drank the same water because there was no better food and no better water to be had at any rank. He talked about the British soldiers they had fought, the Australians and New Zealanders who had earned a particular reputation for ferocity, the Indians whose appearance on the battlefield always signaled a difficult afternoon, the British infantry who were stubborn in a way he had come to respect, in the sense that you respect something that makes your life very difficult. And then the interviewer asked him the question that was the reason for the visit. Did he remember the incident near Gazala in early 1942? He looked at the interviewer for a moment. Then he looked at his hands. I had dysentery, he said. Very bad. I had been ill for 3 days and I was very weak and I had used all my water. I was behind our lines but not very far and our lines were moving, retreating in that phase, so I was in territory that was, uncertain. An Australian soldier found me. He was alone. A scout, I think, looking to see how far back we had gone. He could have left me. I was no use to anyone right then. He could have taken me prisoner, but that would have meant taking me back to his own lines and he was alone and in enemy territory and that was not practical. He could have done the other thing. He gave me water. He left me 2 full canteens. He said something to me, I don't know what, I had no English, and then he left. Stoltz looked up from his hands. I was sick for another 5 days. But I had water. So I did not die. And afterward, When I was better and back with my unit and the war had resumed in the way that wars resume, as though nothing had happened, I thought about that Australian. I thought about him very often. Asterisk. He did not know my name. I did not know his. He probably did not think about me afterward at all. But I thought about him. Asterisk. Because he had made a choice. In a situation where no one would have known if he had made the other choice, he made the one that kept me alive. And I have thought, for 60 years, about why he made that choice, and whether I would have made it, if the positions had been reversed. Asterisk. He picked up his cup of tea and held it. Asterisk. I think I would have. I hope I would have. I believe I would have. But I am not entirely certain, and that uncertainty has never entirely left me. Asterisk. The documentary crew filmed him for 2 hours. They used approximately 4 minutes of the footage. The immediate aftermath of these exchanges was almost always the same. The moment passed. The war continued. The men separated and returned to their respective sides and resumed the machinery of conflict with the same outward efficiency as before. But there was a difference, and the difference was this. They now knew something that could not be unknown. The enemy had a face. The enemy had hands that held a canteen with the same grip as yours. The enemy had a throat that swallowed water in the same way, the same sound, the same relief, the same slight exhalation of breath that follows the first long drink when you are very thirsty. The enemy was tired. The enemy was frightened. The enemy was far from home. And the enemy, when given water instead of a bullet, had looked at you with an expression so transparent and so simple that it had cut through everything, the uniform, the flag, the 2 years of careful instruction in why he deserved to die, and landed somewhere in you that you could not quite name and could not quite reach and could not quite ignore. That was the consequence. Not a policy change. Not a strategic shift. Not the end of the war. Just that. The face that you could not now pretend was not a face. In the months following the North African campaign, when the veterans were being reassigned to European theaters, Italy, France, eventually Germany, something was observed that military psychologists noted without quite knowing what to do with it. The Africa veterans, as they were called, had a different quality in their violence. Not less capable of it. Not more reluctant. But different. As if they understood something about the enemy that soldiers who had trained only in England or America did not yet understand, and that understanding had given the killing a weight it did not carry for men who had not yet been forced to see. One British officer, writing in a private letter to his wife from Italy in 1944, put it this way. Asterisk. The men who were in the desert know something the others don't. It is not a comfortable thing to know. It does not make them gentle. But it makes them more serious, I suppose. As if they understand that what they are doing means something in a way that has to be acknowledged, rather than just done. Asterisk. He was not a poet. He was a signals officer who spent most of his war attending to communications equipment. But he had noticed something real, and he had tried to find words for it, and what he had found was close enough to accurate that the letter was included in a collection of wartime correspondence published in London in 1956. The thing he was trying to describe was the cost of recognition. The weight that comes with knowing, truly knowing, not just abstractly, that the man you are killing is a man. The men who had shared water in the desert carried that weight. It did not stop them fighting. It did not make them compassionate in ways that compromised their military effectiveness. But it was there. And it was something that the dehumanizing machinery of the war had tried to prevent, and failed, at least in those particular men, at least for a while. The war ended, as wars eventually end, with announcements and crowds and the strange, vertiginous silence that follows the cessation of something that had defined every day for years. The men went home. The desert filled in the tracks of the vehicles and the edges of the foxholes and the shallow graves. The equipment rusted. The maps became historical documents. The names, Tobruk, El Alamein, Sidi Rezegh, the Matmata Hills, became the subjects of books and then documentaries and then passing references in school curricula and then, for most people, simply silence. The men who had shared water mostly did not tell anyone. Not their wives in most cases. Not their children. Not the other veterans at the reunions and the pub dinners and the occasional official commemorations. They held those memories the way they held a good many memories of the war, carefully, separately, in a place inside themselves that they had learned to keep from crowding into the other parts of their lives. Some of them told their stories late. Very late. In their 70s and 80s, when there was less to lose from telling the truth and more to lose from taking it to the grave unspoken. A few wrote them down. A few spoke to historians. A few told their children, who sometimes did not know what to do with the information and sometimes held it, quietly, as a kind of inheritance they had not expected. Thomas Hartley's daughter, finding his letter in the box after his death in 1978, read it several times before putting it back. She did not show it to anyone for several years. It seemed, she said much later, private. Like something that belonged to him in a way she was not sure she had the right to open up to the world. But she kept it. And eventually she made a copy. And eventually she wrote a short piece about her father for a Veterans Association newsletter in which she included the passage about the German soldier and the water. The response surprised her. Letters arrived from other veterans' families. Some from British families, some from Commonwealth families, a few from families in Germany and Austria who had heard about the newsletter somehow and written, haltingly, carefully, in imperfect English, to say that their fathers, their grandfathers, had mentioned something similar, had described an encounter in the desert that had stayed with them, had given water or received it or had witnessed it, or had heard about it from a man in their unit who had been there. The letters were all different and all the same. They all described the same quality of incompleteness in the men who had carried the stories. The sense that they had been trying for a long time to find a place to put something that did not fit anywhere that the official version of the war had provided. He used to say one letter read, that the desert taught him something he could not quite name. That it showed him something about people that he was not sure he was supposed to have seen. I never understood exactly what he meant. I think, reading your account of your father's experience, that perhaps I understand a little better now. Werner Baumgartner, the German corporal who had dressed the British sergeant's wound and left him water and marked the location on his map, lived until 1993. He taught history and geography in a school in Bavaria for 31 years. His colleagues described him as rigorous and demanding, but also, one said, deeply committed to the idea that students should be able to see through other people's eyes. He spent considerable time in his history classes on the question of what ordinary people had done and believed and chosen during the war, not the large figures, not the generals and the politicians, but the men who had been standing in the desert or the field or the street when history arrived and required something of them. He died before the era of digital archives and online testimonies. His diary was donated to a regional archive in Bavaria by his son in 2001, and it was there that the historian Dieter Koch found it and quoted from it in his study of soldier experience in North Africa. The entry about the British sergeant is 11 lines long. It describes the wound, the dressing, the water, and the decision not to take the man prisoner. It ends with the line already quoted, "He was frightened and the water seemed to help," and then a space and then a note about the weather. That is all. 11 lines and the next morning's weather and 31 years of teaching young people to see through other people's eyes. The connection between these things is not stated anywhere in the record. It does not need. Captain Andrew Breen, the New Zealand medical officer who treated the 2 German soldiers near the Matmata Hills, returned to Christchurch after the war and worked as a general practitioner until his retirement in 1971. His memoir was printed in a run of 50 copies and distributed among friends and family. A copy made its way in the 1990s to the Imperial War Museum in London, where it sits in the archive accessible to researchers who know to ask for it. The passage quoted earlier, about the young German soldier who had expected to be shot, and about being lied to in the same way for the same reasons, appears near the end of the Tunisia section. What follows it in the memoir is not a conclusion or a lesson. Breen was not that kind of writer. What follows it is a description of the drive back to the medical facility through the late afternoon light over the Tunisian hills, with the 2 wounded German soldiers on stretchers in the back of the vehicle, and Breen sitting up front watching the light change on the ridgelines. He wrote, the younger one, the one who had done the talking, fell asleep on the way back. He slept the way very exhausted people sleep, absolutely like a man who has put everything down. His hands were open. Just open on the stretcher, palms up. I keep coming back to that image. I don't know why. The hills were very beautiful in that light. The war, from that particular vantage point, was somewhere else entirely. It was just a truck moving through the late afternoon and 2 sleeping men and the light. James Cavanaugh, the American sergeant who gave his canteen to the dying Japanese soldier in the Philippine jungle, did not talk about it for 27 years. He mentioned it first to his wife in 1971, the same year he gave the interview to the oral historian. He had been watching a television program about the Pacific War, one of the early documentary series that had begun in the late 1960s, to examine the conflict with somewhat more complexity than the triumphant narratives of the immediate post-war years. He had turned off the television partway through, she said later, and sat for a long time, and then told her about the moment in the jungle. Just told her, without preamble, as if he had been carrying it around and needed to put it somewhere. She did not say much, she recalled. She listened. She understood, without being told, that this was something he had needed to say for a very long time. When he was done, she made tea and they sat together, and he did not explain further and she did not ask. I think, she said, in a brief interview conducted by a university student as part of a Veterans Voices project in 2003, 3 years after Cavanaugh's death, that he had always been afraid that if he told anyone, they would either say he had done the wrong thing, or they would say he had done the right thing, and either answer would have been the wrong answer. Because the thing about it, and this took me years to understand, is that it was not about right or wrong. It was just something that happened between 2 people in a very particular moment, and it meant something that didn't fit into any of the usual categories. He thought about those 2 hands holding the canteen for the rest of his life. He told me that. I think what he meant was that he had been reminded, when he least expected it, that the war was happening to people. Not to enemies. People. The landscape of North Africa has changed enormously since 1942. The cities along the coast have grown. The roads have been modernized. The oil fields discovered in the 1950s brought infrastructure and population to places that had previously been too empty to sustain either. The railway halt at El Alamein now sits beside a museum, and on certain dates in October, the anniversary of Montgomery's Great Offensive, ceremonies are held and speeches are given and the flags of the Allied nations ripple in the coastal wind. But go far enough inland away from the coast road and the museum and the ceremony, and the landscape is still what it was. Flat and white and silent and enormous. The sun arriving before you are ready for it. The horizon dissolving into heat shimmer. The sky an enormous indifferent blue. There is nothing to mark the places where the small things happened. No plaque for the spot where a German corporal knelt beside a wounded British sergeant and gave him water. No memorial for the depression in the ground where 2 German soldiers lay and an Allied medical officer chose mercy over expediency. Nothing to indicate where any of it occurred. The dozens, hundreds, unrecorded many of these moments that happened in the years when 2 armies circled each other in this desert and slowly, despite everything, began to see. Those places exist only inside the men who were there. And the men are all gone now. What remains is what they left behind. The letters and the diaries and the interviews and the one short memoir printed in 50 copies that found its way to London. The daughter's newsletter and the letters it generated from families on both sides who recognized something in it. The schoolteacher who spent 31 years asking his students to try to see through other people's eyes. And the image that Cavanaugh could not leave behind. 2 hands holding a canteen. There is a question that runs through all of these accounts, unasked but present. The question that explains why these men carried their memories in silence for so long, and why the silence was so difficult to break and why breaking it when it finally happened, seemed to cost them something and relieve them of something in equal measure. The question is simply this. If the man on the other side was also a man, if he held water the same way, if he showed his fear the same way, if he slept with his hands open when he was exhausted, if the thirst felt the same and the relief felt the same, then what exactly was the war? Not whether it was necessary. Not whether the causes were just or unjust. Those questions have answers, complicated and contested answers, but answers nonetheless. The question beneath the question is a different one. It is the question about what you do with the knowledge of a shared humanity that you discover inside a process designed to deny it. It is the question about how you continue, once you have given someone your last water and watched him drink it, to locate him in the category that made the giving seem impossible in the first place. The men who asked this question, quietly, privately, over decades, did not find a satisfying answer. Perhaps there is not one. Perhaps the question is not the kind that resolves into an answer so much as the kind that simply remains, a presence in the life of anyone who carries it, like water that has absorbed the mineral taste of the place it came from and retains it long after you have carried it somewhere else. In a small archive in Dusseldorf, there is a box that contains, among other things, a German field canteen from the Second World War. It is dented. The strap is cracked. The identification marks have been partly worn away. It belonged to a man named Heinz Stoltz, and he kept it for 60 years after an Australian soldier left him 2 full canteens in the desert south of Gazala and walked away without looking back. He could not say in the documentary interview why he had kept it. He was not a man who kept things. His daughter confirmed this. He had given away most of the objects he had accumulated over his life. He was not sentimental, she said, in the ordinary way. But he kept the canteen. It sat on a shelf in his study. He did not display it. He did not explain it to visitors. It was simply there, the way certain objects are simply there in a life. Neither decoration nor relic, but something that remains because putting it away would be a kind of untruth. When the documentary crew asked him about it, he picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at it for a long time. Then he put it back on the shelf. I don't know what to tell you, he said. I kept it because it seemed wrong to throw it away. Because something happened with it that I couldn't account for in any language I know how to use. A man I never met gave me his water. I drank it. I lived. He walked away into the desert. He looked at the canteen on the shelf. That's all I can tell you. But it was enough. Whatever it was enough. The desert keeps its silence. The heat rises as it always has before dawn. The light comes in low across the flat ground. Nothing moves. Nothing waits. Nothing has been waiting. Only the morning, arriving again as it always does, indifferent to what was done here, indifferent to what was given and what was received, indifferent to the thirst and the gift and the 2 hands holding the canteen. The morning comes anyway. And somewhere, in the way that some things survive longer than the men who carried them, the water is still passing.